big part of our meeting.
Oh my gosh, they just say like, yeah, how many of my sweating?
I don't know, are we all singing a bit?
Is this cool. Well, thank you guys for all being here. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me. And I found out a couple days ago. But yeah, so I'm just going to pray real quick before I start and we'll get into it. So, dear God, just thank you so much for the opportunity I have to just study your word and teach on it, God. We just thank you so much for the gift of your word and what it means to us. And I pray that today that what I say will be true to the meaning of this passage, and that we will just all in a way edified from what it has to say. And we pray, amen. Okay, so my first semester of senior year in high school, I experienced a time of spiritual hardship. It was a time where I was second-guessing almost everything I had once believed in. It was a stage of doubt that I experienced for a 3-month period. And this was a doubt that was just a faith-shaking doubt that persisted every single day for that period of time. I doubted whether or not my faith was real. I doubted the authenticity of the Bible. And I doubted just, in general, the importance of my spiritual life. During this stage of my life, I was depressed and I was emotionally and spiritually just worn out. I was spending so much time just asking God, why? I didn't understand why I had to go through that time. And when I was in that stage of my life, I didn't see an end to it. There didn't seem to be a light at the end of the tunnel. And I felt like I was being tested by God, and I didn't know why. I didn't get the purpose or what the outcome was supposed to be of this testing. Have you ever felt like you're being tested by God? Maybe you're going through a really hard time and you didn't understand why. Maybe you experienced a time of doubt, as I did. Maybe you lost a job or had a significant injury. Maybe he was asking you to do something really difficult and challenging. Maybe he was asking you to leave the country and to spread his word across the nations. Maybe he was asking you to give up something that was really important to you. If you've experienced this feeling that you're being tested by God, then you would probably ask the next question, which is, well, why would God do that? Why would he test me in this way? Well, today we're going to look at a passage in the book of Genesis that deals with this question. The story we're going to be looking at today is a narrative involving Abraham and his son Isaac. And this story is found in Genesis 22, 1 through 19. And I'm going to read the first 3 verses just to start us off. So it says, "After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham,' he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.' So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him." So the narrative opens with the blatant statement that God is going to test Abraham. God's intentions, they really couldn't be any more clear than that. It is stated just right in the text. And this is a really good place for us to start, just knowing this idea that God was testing Abraham. And I just want us to keep that in the back of our minds as we continue. The narrative continues with God's voice commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. God does not give Abraham necessarily specific directions on how to get there, but he expects him to obey nevertheless. And Abraham wakes up the next morning, he cuts the wood for the burnt offering, and sets off to the place that God had told him. So with the beginning of this narrative kind of under our belts, we can go on to our first question that we want to ask from the story. And that is, what is Abraham's response to God's test? The readers have been told that God is testing Abraham, but he doesn't know it yet. Abraham doesn't have Genesis, flipping through to see how it ends. He's living this out, like this is happening to him right then. So the first few verses of the narrative explain exactly what's at stake here. They tell the reader just how much responding in obedience to God was going to cost Abraham. And what I mean by that is, it is interesting to note how matter-of-factly the beginning of this narrative seems to play out. If you don't look too deeply at the text, then you might think that there isn't really any emotion portrayed here at all. However, if we take a closer look, we can see that the author did indeed hint to the distress God's request would cause Abraham. In verse 2, God says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So here the author essentially states the same thing 3 times in a row to get the message across. He just says, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land and offer him as a sacrifice. And the statement is intended to show the reader just how much emotional pain responding in obedience would cause Abraham. Isaac was Abraham's only son of his wife Sarah, and he was born to Abraham in his old age. And Isaac was a promise from God. And he meant the world to Abraham, and losing him was next to unthinkable. And the stakes were high. And this element just played a huge factor in Abraham's decision, his relationship with his son. Another factor that plays into his response to God's command is revealed when we look at the larger context of this passage in the book of Genesis. In the previous chapter, chapter 21, God promises Abraham that he will have descendants through Isaac. We're going to take a look at a couple verses in this chapter, but let me set this here real quick. Abraham's wife, Sarah, gives birth to Isaac in her old age, just as God said she would. However, Abraham already had another son through Sarah's servant Hagar when they tried to make God's promise of a son happen on their own terms. In this passage we're going to look at, Sarah wants to throw Hagar out because she now had her own son, and she was jealous of Hagar and Ishmael, which is the son Abraham had with her. But because of this request, Abraham is severely distressed. So I'm just going to read verses 10 through 12 of chapter 21. They say, "So she said to Abraham, 'Cast out the slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be an heir with my son Isaac.' And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, 'Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named.'" So God promises in this chapter that Abraham's line will be continued through Isaac, his son. So just this fact has got to be running through Abraham's mind when he's deciding on how to respond in chapter 22. God just promised that Abraham would have descendants through Isaac, and in the very next chapter asked him to sacrifice his son. Abraham has got to be, just absolutely dumbfounded. I'm sure that this makes no sense to him. One minute God is telling Abraham that he will have grandchildren through Isaac, and then the next God tells him to sacrifice his son. Abraham is in a state of just brokenness and confusion at this point. This is kind of where we are so far in our story. Abraham is dealing with the emotional pain that would come from obeying God's command, and he is also confused. This request by God, it doesn't make sense to Abraham in the light of the previous promise. However, despite all this, Abraham chooses to obey God. Despite the emotional and psychological turmoil he is in, he decides to follow God's command. And we read in verse 3 that Abraham woke up the next morning, prepared everything for the sacrifice, and set out to the place God had told him to go. So our answer then is that Abraham responds in obedience to God's test. He doesn't know what will happen. He cannot foresee the future or the outcome, but Abraham trusts in God, and that trust turns to obedience. So we've kind of established Abraham's response, and we know that he trusted God, and this allows us to kind of move into our next question, which is, how difficult would God's test be? I just mentioned just a little bit ago earlier how much I mentioned just earlier how much responding in obedience would cost Abraham. But now we're going to look at the test itself and just kind of see how it played out. In order to do this, we need to just continue reading. So verses 4 through 8 say, "On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you.' And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am, my son.' He said, 'Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?' Abraham said, 'God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son.' So they went, both of them together." So we've kind of come to the point in the narrative where Abraham is starting to deal with the effects of this test. And this part of the story reveals to us several ways in which the road was getting hard for Abraham. And the first of which is stated in verse 4, where it says, "On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar." And the part that I want to focus here is the phrase, "on the third day." You know, if we think about it, it had taken them 3 days to get to the place where God wanted them to go. I mean, that just hadn't been torture. I mean, it had been 3 whole days since Abraham got the command from God to sacrifice his son. This means that it was 3 days for Abraham to think about his decision. I mean, 3 days of sleepless nights, and 3 days of Abraham thinking that these would be the last moments that he spent with his son Isaac. The road was getting tough. And I'm sure the temptation to turn around and spare the life of his son was big in his mind. Abraham had a lot of time to think about his decision, and the ability to move forward, I'm sure, just got harder and harder with every hour that passed. And that's one hint from the passage, just telling us how hard this test was. Another detail in the passage that adds to the intensity of this test is found in verses 7 and 8. Here we read that Isaac asked Abraham where the sacrifice for the burnt offering was. I mean, for Isaac, this wasn't his first rodeo. He knew that in order to have a burnt offering, there needed to be a sacrifice. And what stands out about this detail is in the Middle Eastern culture in this time period, young boys were not allowed to speak unless they were asked to several times by their elders. So Isaac was breaking the cultural norm by doing this. He was putting himself on the line by speaking up for his father. And this was a big deal, and Isaac would not have just done this for any reason. But because of this fact, you get the feeling that he sensed that something was wrong, that something was out of the norm. He knew what there needed to be in order to have a sacrifice, and it wasn't there. He was confused to the point that he brought it up to his father, despite all the cultural rules he was breaking. And knowing this makes Abraham's response even more interesting. Abraham said, "God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son." And this passage does not give us any more details on Abraham, what Abraham meant by this statement. I mean, did he say it just to relieve Isaac of any suspicions he had? Did he say it thinking that Isaac was indeed going to be the sacrifice that God had provided? Or did he say it in just a weak effort to convince himself that everything was going to be okay? However he said it, it is evident that Abraham was starting to realize and experience just how hard this test was from God. It was not something that was over quickly. I mean, Abraham had plenty of time to think over the gravity of his obedience, and it didn't help that his son was just confused. The answer to our second question, then, that God's test for Abraham was extremely hard. It was not easy by any means. Our answer, that's kind of an obvious answer, but it's an important one to note nonetheless, because we need to understand that this test wasn't just some walk in the park. I mean, it was hard. Okay, so far we have come to learn that Abraham responded in obedience to God's test, but that the test itself was intensely difficult. So let's continue to read and just see how the story ends here. This is verse 9 through 19. It says, when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba. So the conclusion of this narrative is really just rich with imagery. I mean, you can picture Abraham tying his son down onto the altar, and if Isaac wasn't suspicious before, he was now. Then you can see Abraham lifting the knife to kill his son, whom he loved, and then all of a sudden, everything stops. The angel of the Lord commands Abraham to put down his knife and untie his child. And you can imagine just how good of news that sounded to Abraham. The test was finally over. Abraham breathed a heavy sigh of relief and joy. It was done. Then the narrative moves into a list of blessings that God bestowed upon Abraham. And this leads us into our next question. And that is, in what ways does God provide for Abraham? The first way in which God provided for Abraham might be a more obvious one, but that is that he saved Isaac. I mean, Abraham loved Isaac deeply, and God knew that well. In fact, God was the one who told Abraham this back in verse 3, if you remember, when he said, take your son, your only son, whom you love. Isaac was quite literally a gift from God. God had blessed Abraham and Sarah with Isaac in their old age, and then saved him from death. God knew too well the pain that would come from sacrificing his son. I mean, he spared Abraham's son, and yet he gave up his own. So this pain was not unfamiliar to him. God did not have to spare Isaac, but he did. And this is one of the ways that God provided for Abraham. Another way God provided was through the ram caught in the thicket. Not only did God spare Isaac, but he provided a replacement sacrifice so that Abraham and his son could still worship. Abraham and Isaac had already brought all the supplies for the sacrifice up into the mountain, and God was going to make a use of it. There's also an interesting literary pattern in this part of the story that I want to take a look at, and it's a phrase that occurs twice in the narrative, and it's the phrase, he lifted up his eyes. The first time we see this is in verse 4, when Abraham, he lifted up his eyes and saw the place where he would sacrifice Isaac. And then the next time Abraham lifted up his eyes, it was in verse 13, where he saw the ram that God had provided to replace Isaac as the sacrifice. It's just kind of an interesting contrast to note, and it emphasizes the importance of the ram and the fact that God had provided it. So the second way God provided for Abraham was through the gift of a ram. And the last way God provided for Abraham that I want to look at was through the blessings that he bestowed upon him. Just listen to verses 16 through 18 real quick again. It says, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So the first blessing that God gives to Abraham is the blessing of descendants. not just a few descendants either. God was going to make Abraham's line into a nation, and we know that to be the nation of Israel. God continues to say that his offspring will possess the gate of his enemies, and this means that his descendants would conquer their enemies. Finally, God says that Abraham's descendants will be a blessing to all the other nations of the earth because they had obeyed him. And I'm sure for Abraham that was just an absolutely insane idea. But we know that Jesus was a descendant of Abraham, and that he is a blessing to all nations. And this is one of the ways that blessing came true. Overall, God blessed Abraham in some, pretty crazy ways. So the answer to our question of how did God provide for Abraham is answered through these three ways: through saving Isaac, through providing a ram, and through blessing Abraham. So far, we've just been making our way through the passage and asking some questions along the way. We've looked at how Abraham responded to God in obedience to his test. We have learned that God's test for Abraham was a difficult one. And finally, we've looked at the different ways God provided for Abraham. And all of this has been leading up to the final question that it's going to combine with our conclusion here. And it is a question that I hinted at the beginning of the message, but it is one that we can now understand better in the light of the questions that we've already answered so far. And this question is, why did God test Abraham? We've talked about the test, talked about how hard it was and how God provided at the end, but ultimately we want to know why all of it happened. What was the purpose of the whole thing? Why couldn't have God just have given Abraham the ram in the first place, told him to sacrifice that and be done with it? Well, in order to find our answer to this question, we have to look at what God taught Abraham from this experience. What did Abraham learn from this test? What was his takeaway? And this is kind of the really important part. And this is the fundamental lesson that Abraham learned as a result of this test, is that God is sufficient. Abraham learned through that whole experience that God's enough. God provided for him in ways that he never could have imagined and never would have learned this lesson if he had not been completely obedient throughout the whole thing. If he had turned back on day 2 of the journey, when things were just starting to get hard, then he would not have experienced God's great sufficiency. He had to go right up to the moment before he was going to kill Isaac to learn the lesson that is the main point of this message. In the end, then, the whole purpose of this test was so that Abraham could learn God's sufficiency and God's provision. And that's the whole purpose of this message. So going back to the story I was telling at the beginning of this message, of the time where I was being tested, the time of doubt that I experienced, I didn't understand the purpose of that test when I was in the middle of it. My experience was much, much milder than Abraham's, but I could still relate to him in some small way. I was confused and broken, as he was. I tried to stay obedient to God, despite all these feelings of doubt that I had, but that didn't mean I understood completely what was going on. However, there was a light at the end of that tunnel, and the time of doubt ended after a couple months, and I was able to reflect on that time and start to see the purpose of it. One of the only things I was able to hold on to during that time was the small sense that God was indeed still who he said he was, and that he was with me. That was one of the only things that got me through that time, and that is ultimately what I held on to. And reflecting on that time of testing made me realize that through it, God was able to teach me something that my stubborn, selfish self would have otherwise just completely discarded, and that is that God is sufficient. I didn't have much during that time, but I did have God, and that is what got me through. So here we come to the main point of this message, and that is just that God is sufficient. And now that we've kind of established this, what does it matter? What are we supposed to do with this information? What difference does it make? Well, God's sufficiency should spur us on to obey him fully in our lives. Abraham discovered God's sufficiency when he obeyed him through his time of testing, and so will we. Charles Spurgeon wrote, "As for his failing you, never dream of it. Hate the thought of it. The God who has been sufficient until now should be trusted to the end." Times of testing are hard, and there's no denying that. Abraham experienced this to an effect that hopefully none of us will ever have to. But this doesn't mean that our times of testing will be easy. We need to be obedient to God in the storms of our life and in the good times we have in order to experience God's sufficiency. In conclusion, then, this week we should reflect on how we can be obedient to God and trust that He is sufficient for us in all circumstances. I wanted to end just by reading Psalms 46. It's a poem about God's sufficiency for us. I just thought it fit really well within the main point of this message. So I'm going to read it real quick. It says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter, He utters His voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how He has brought desolations on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I'll be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. And just my prayers that we would move that. So that's kind of it. That's all I got. I need critique because I'm not the most talented public speaker, so I just love critique.
Does your critique need to be on tape?
No, it doesn't. Yeah, you can turn it off if you want to.
Hopefully it do.
Yeah.
No.
What critique? There are 3 added small articles